Spindletop, James Clark, Michael Halbouty. Chapter 1. The Prophet. As Petillo Higgins rode toward Beaumont on the afternoon of January 10th, 1901, he was met on the outskirts of town by Jim Collar. "Hey, Bud," Collar yelled. "The well blew in on the hill this morning, and the people in town are saying you are the wisest man on earth." Higgins lifted himself in his saddle and looked in the direction of the hill. He could see a cloud of dark mist out towards Gladys City. That morning at 10:30, the Lucas Gusher had roared in like a shot from a heavy cannon, and had spouted oil 100 feet over the top of the derrick, out on the hummock that the world would soon know as Spindletop. Beaumont had been blasted out of its normal tranquility. 4 miles to the south of the little Texas town was one of the greatest natural phenomena man had ever seen. News tickers were flashing the story to the four corners of the earth. Excited men were already pouring into Beaumont, and this was only the beginning. Captain Anthony F. Lucas, yesterday's wildcatter, was today's man of the hour. Newsmen, oilmen, and financial and industrial leaders were quoting and requoting his words around the nation. Petillo Higgins, his fellow citizens knew now, was the real prophet of this great event. Whatever it was to mean, it was ironic that it should happen while he was out of town. That day Higgins had been in the woods, looking over timber lands. Jim Collar's greeting was the first he knew of the discovery. "Hell, Bud, ain't you surprised?" Collar inquired. "Not exactly," Jim Higgins said with a smile. "Don't you remember that I've been telling everyone for more than 10 years this would happen? It all started years before. In fact, it started when Petillo Higgins first gave up his logging job on the upper reaches of the Neches to return to his hometown and enter business. A former Peck's bad boy, Higgins had surprised the populace by coming home, joining the Baptist church, and getting himself started in real estate. That was back in the middle 80s. He still had some 5 or 6 years to go before he got interested in finding oil and building industry. He was a loose-jointed, tall, blue-eyed, one-armed young man who had a reputation for being better in a scrap with his one arm than most Texans were with two. The son of the town's only gunsmith, he was an expert draftsman, a fine mechanic, and a self-educated man with complete self-assurance who did well in anything he undertook. Spindletop Springs, south of town, on the banks of the Neches River, was an ideal spot for outings. One afternoon, Higgins, who now taught in the Baptist Sunday school, took his class there on a picnic. When the picnic was over, he and the children drove to the round mound a mile or so west, up on the hill, which rose some 15 feet above the surrounding prairie. He punched a cane into the ground and then lit a flame as the gas escaped. It was fun for the children, and it intrigued Higgins. He made a mental note to come back and find out more about it. During the next few years, Higgins' real estate dealings brought him a good living, and he acquired some land of his own. He became a recognized specialist in timberlands. Since he was his own boss, he had time to engage in his hobbies. A consuming interest in education caused him to spend hours in study. Not only did he master the Bible, but he studied economics, history, chemistry, and even philosophy. An aptitude for mechanics and designing inherited from his father was always useful. His years in the woods and on the river taught him to recognize nature's signs. In those years, he also learned to deal with men. But Tilo Higgins held two important views. One was that for a man to be a success in any field, he must know mechanics and be able to build and invent. The other was that anything another man could master, he could master too. His curiosity frequently lured him back to Big Hill, as the natives called the low prairie mound. One of the attractions there was the Sour Wells Resort. It consisted of a half-dozen square boxes, fashioned out of cypress boards, containing blue, green, and yellow waters, with a range of palatability and odor from that of lemon phosphate to kerosene, and the revolting flavor of rotten eggs. Some waters were to bathe in, others were to drink. The range of its effects was equal to that of its colors and odors. The water would either bind its partakers tighter than the head of an Indian war drum, or send them scampering to the tall timbers with a case of what was quaintly referred to as the flying axe handles. The superstitious steered clear of the mound at night. They reported a ghost which came from the hill on nocturnal visits to Spindletop Springs, down by the river. Others would see the wraith-like figures of St. Elmo's lights dancing wildly about the mound at night. The hill wasn't an ordinary place. There was a scientific answer to its peculiarities that Tilo Higgins would find somewhere. In the course of his business, Higgins had acquired several hundred acres of land east of the Neches in Orange County. He looked on it as good farm land, riding across the tract one day on horseback. After a heavy rain, he noticed an unusual reddish outcropping on the ground. Dismounting, he examined further and found a moist and plastic clay. Looking about, he could see there were acres of it. He took a sample to town and tested it chemically. It was an unusually high grade of brick clay. Already convinced that his part of the country had many natural advantages for industrial development, he considered the possibility of a brick business. At that time, it was necessary to bring brick in from the east when it was needed. Houston, 90 miles west, had started building multi-story brick buildings. Soon Beaumont would do the same, so Higgins resolved to sell the idea of starting a brick factory to local capital. It didn't take too much selling. Several men of means encouraged Higgins and agreed that he should take a trip east to look at operating brickyards. Within a week, he was on his way. He visited brick plants in Pennsylvania, Indiana, Ohio, and New York to learn the cost of equipment, methods of operation, and types of skills necessary. The most interesting thing he noticed was that oil and gas were being used for fuel. Plant managers explained that these fuels were easier to install, more efficient to operate, and that they burned with a constant temperature. That was something neither wood nor coal would do. As a matter of fact, they explained, without such fuels, it might not be wise to consider going into the brick business. While he was in the East, Higgins took the time to visit several oil fields to learn more about the source of fuel for brickyards. He inquired about methods used in determining the existence of oil and gas, and was convinced that such methods were fairly simple. Petillo Higgins looked around for nature's signboards and found them. What he found were the same signs he had seen on Big Hill, such as the odors of the escaping gas, the texture of the earth, and the taste of the water. If oil and gas could be found in Pennsylvania, there was no reason it couldn't be found in Texas, Higgins reasoned. With this fuel, industrial possibilities would be unlimited. The oil men he talked with spoke of geology as it applied to recognizing surface indications of oil. They were certain that oil would never be found anywhere except in the East. Higgins decided he would have to know more about geology. That was one subject he had not included in his studies. The success of his new venture might depend on finding oil and gas. Before he left the East, he wrote a letter to the director of the United States Geological Survey, requesting available information on petroleum geology, particularly as it pertained to the Gulf Coast. The brick business didn't develop. When Higgins returned home, he found that Beaumont's venture capital had gone into a new furniture factory. This was a disappointment, but he was consoled by the fact that he had found an entirely new interest in life in the oil fields of Pennsylvania and Ohio. For weeks, he read the government's book on geology. From it, he gleaned information that completely fascinated him. The scientific facts it explained were devoured and digested, but when it came to conclusions, he parted company with the government's geologist. The booklet stated that oil-bearing rock probably did not exist along the Gulf Coast. Out on the mound at Big Hill, he had seen things the geologist hadn't written about. Why did sulfured hydrogen gas come oozing out of the copperous springs, causing bubbles to play on the water like minute raindrops? The authors of the booklet were smart men, but they were wrong. There was oil and gas at Big Hill, plenty of it. That was Higgins' conclusion. But to be certain, he rode back to the hill and explored every possibility. He dug post holes 6 to 10 feet deep and found everything he needed to convince himself. From the crest of the hill, he looked around the countryside. There was the railroad to Sabine Pass on the west. It wasn't more than a mile east to the river, where packets and barges plied their trade. It was less than 15 miles south to Sabine Lake. The land was a flat prairie all around the hill in every direction, except to the east, where a vast marshland started on the Orange County side of the river. 4 miles to the north was Beaumont. With the fuel he could produce from the hill, this could be the greatest industrial center in the South. Nature had not only painted her signboards here, she had endowed this country with every advantage and resource. On the north edge of the hill, Higgins saw a little sign, which read, "This 1,077 acres for sale, cheap," and gave the name of the agent. The tract was in the James A. Veitch survey. Higgins went directly to the agent in Beaumont and found that it could be bought for $6 an acre. As a matter of fact, 1,000 would buy an option on the entire tract for several months. At home that evening, Higgins didn't sleep. He spent most of the night working on figures and studying the county map. He noted the bayous, the lakes, and the wooded sections. His plan in its entirety encompassed an area extending 15 miles from the hill to Sabine Lake, and covering a swath 5 miles wide. The next morning Vatilo Higgins was out early. He took his plan to the town's leading men. As the hours, then days, went by, he realized he was not getting anywhere. When he spoke of oil, he spoke of wells producing thousands of barrels. When he spoke of returns for stockholders in his industrial city, he spoke of millions of dollars. He had been given the light to see, but he hadn't been given the power to convey his foresight to others. Frustration met him at every side. It seemed that men who had previously respected him were now avoiding him. Was there no one who would help? It was this question that brought back to his mind an offer made 9 years before. He thought of George W. Carroll, now the president and general manager of the Beaumont Lumber Company, and one of the most prosperous citizens in town. Why hadn't he thought of Carroll before? Why didn't he think of him first as the man to share this potential wealth? Tomorrow he would certainly see Mr. Carroll. On the night that Higgins had come out of the tall pines along the river to accept conversation, he had been met by George Washington Carroll after the services. Impressed by Higgins' decision to join the church, Carroll had stopped the younger man to offer him help should he ever need it. Carroll was the head of a lumber company for which Higgins had worked, and he had been a neighbor of the Higgins family in Beaumont for years. The town's leading Baptist, he was proud of Higgins and had been largely responsible for his acceptance by the rest of the citizens. A man of tremendous energy and drive, an able executive, George Carroll was to become Beaumont's most prosperous and prominent citizen. He was to run for governor of Texas and vice president of the United States on the Prohibition ticket. He would become as rich as Croesus because of Vatilo Higgins. Then he would die humbly in a single room in the YMCA and be buried simply from a church, both of which had been built with his dollars. Here was a Baptist that even the irreverent Mr. Minkin could accept. Higgins met the young lumber executive next morning in Carroll's home. He spread his plan out on the floor so that he could explain in detail the great potential wealth lying beneath the hummock a mile west of Spindletop Springs. Geological indications had been correlated with a homemade chemical analysis of the soil and waters from the hill. The terrain's adaptability to industrialization was indicated on a dog-eared county map. After looking over the plans, they drove out to the hill. The odor of the sour wells permeated the air. It was perfume to Higgins, though because it revealed much of his story. The horse was hitched to a coffee-berry shrub, and Carroll followed Higgins from one oil and gas indication to another. Then Higgins showed Carroll the tract of land which took in the west edge of the hill. Carroll considered the matter on the way to town, and decided to invest $1,000 in the option if Higgins would arrange for a joint loan to cover the remainder of the purchase price. Higgins was certain Frank Alvey, cashier of the bank, would make a loan if Carroll would sign the note. The deal was made on that basis. Now Higgins wanted the remainder of the survey, which when completely assembled would take in 2/3 of the hill. He made an extensive investigation of the ownership and found that the survey consisted of some 2,750 acres. Captain George W. O'Brien held 1,350 acres. J.F. Lanier had 273 acres, and about 50 acres were in the name of the Cleveland heirs, with titles in an almost inextricable confusion. Higgins and Carroll agreed that their company should have the entire survey, if possible, and Higgins was authorized to negotiate for the other land. Being a man who believed the most difficult task should be tackled first, he went to the law offices of Captain George Washington O'Brien. Tall and handsome, with a disarming Irish twinkle in his eyes, O'Brien was a fine lawyer and a conservative man in his middle 50s. An eminent citizen, he was the first resident attorney in Beaumont, the founder of the town's Methodist Church, and Grand Master of the Masonic Lodge. Captain O'Brien listened attentively to Higgins' offer to purchase his land. He asked what the land would be used for and who would assist Higgins in financing the purchase. Higgins said that he believed it had industrial possibilities, maybe oil, and that Carroll was his only associate. Trying to temper his enthusiasm so as not to run up the price, he explained the surface indications and his reasons for believing there might be oil under the hill. The captain said he would like to think about the matter for a few days, and invited Higgins to return. In those 2 or 3 days, O'Brien recollected 3 incidents of his earlier life which had always intrigued him. He recalled how, during the Civil War days, he and his men, while camped on the hill, had been annoyed by the odor of gas seepage. Then there was a letter which he had received from one of his fellow officers after the war, predicting great oil discoveries in this part of the country. And finally, he remembered a man who years ago claimed to have traced a tremendous oil vein from the Rocky Mountains right down to this section. And so, when Patillo Higgins returned at the appointed time, O'Brien informed him that while he was not interested in selling his property, he would, however, be willing to put his acreage into a company that might be formed by all of the landowners in the survey. A few days later, 4 men met in O'Brien's office to form a company that was to have a tremendous part in bringing about a new world and a new concept of abundance. Besides Higgins, Carroll, and O'Brien, the 4th man was J.F. Lanier, who owned the only other tract of significant size in the Vetch survey. He was coming in under exactly the same terms as O'Brien. "Gentlemen," said Patillo Higgins, "if you will support my plan, you will all become millionaires. Further than that, if other citizens of Beaumont will help finance this scheme, they will all become millionaires too." Then he produced a sketch he had drawn the night before. It depicted 8 or 10 sections, lined or shaded to indicate different subsurface strata. An uplift in the lines was explained as the condition that existed on the hill. Geologists, he explained, called the fold of these uplifted strata an anticline. It was caused by some unusual subsurface condition. Then he explained what he had learned of gravity, pressures, and subterranean water levels. In a few minutes he demonstrated that he was no dreamer, but a practical geologist who had devoted much thought to his subject. When Higgins finished his discussion, George Carroll, who had been elected president earlier in the meeting, asked if anyone had given thought to a letterhead for the company. Higgins had his suggestion ready. He brought forth a rough design that he had worked up. Across the top in bold, shaded letters were the words, Gladys City Oil, Gas, and Manufacturing Company. In small letters, centered beneath the company's title, was its location, Gladys City, Texas. The capital stock of 200,000, the names of the officers, and location of the main office in Beaumont were shown in a box on the left under the heading. Prominently displayed was a photograph of little Gladys Bingham, a member of his Sunday school class for whom he proposed to name his city. Then, in a long, narrow sketch across 2/3 of the top of the page, was a drawing of Higgins' idea of the city's future appearance. In the foreground were about 25 oil storage tanks of varying sizes. Behind the tanks were the smokestacks of a dozen plants and several brick buildings. The other stockholders questioned the advisability of having a letterhead depicting a non-existent scene. Higgins replied that if this picture could prod the imagination of others, it would be helpful in selling stock in the company to finance the oil operations. Higgins then presented an outline of a plat of Gladys City. It covered almost twice as much land as the company held, including all of the hill. It was his idea that soon others would want to get into the Gladys City Company. Industrial and residential lots surrounded the hill. The Gladys City industrial lots, he explained, were in the center because they were the only two lots on which he expected to bore for oil and gas. Mineral rights would not be sold to others. There were churches of all denominations, a hospital, parks, schools, a college, a large hotel covering 2 entire squares, a fire station, and a glass plant specifically provided for. Railroads were shown as crossing each other at right angles in the very center of the platted area. It was an ambitious plan on paper, and the other stockholders seemed pleased with it. There was some doubt on the part of everyone except Higgins, but he was authorized to engage Ellie Daniel, a civil engineer, to survey the area. Higgins' enthusiasm was refreshing, but his associates saw that they were in for a little more and a little faster action than they had bargained for. These were conservative men who were aware of pitfalls and wanted to take every step only after a thorough examination of the ground ahead. They all had faith in Higgins, but they could foresee trouble in adjusting their tempo to that of a prophet. The first meeting of the Gladys City Oil, Gas, and Manufacturing Company closed. The minutes were dated August 10th, 1892. Chapter 2. 3 Holes in the Hill. 6 months later, George Carroll and Captain O'Brien were harassed and beaten men. Day after day they had been hounded and annoyed by Patillo Higgins. They sat together in the French cafe, pondering their problem. Their trouble, as Higgins had told them, was that they couldn't make up their minds. From the day the Gladys City Company's charter had been received, Patillo Higgins had been ready to start work. The other directors had postponed things until they could be certain it was wise to borrow and spend the money necessary for drilling operations. Higgins had just left them after delivering a good-natured but hard-hitting appraisal of their action. He had told them the story of the captain of a schooner who would run his vessel into a port to unload. When he had unloaded his cargo and found that the wind was fair for sailing, he would wait to see if it would hold out. Then Higgins told them the wind would change and the captain would wait again for more favorable weather. Gentlemen, he kept that up and never got out of port. Higgins said, "Let his stupidity be a lesson to us." Higgins had tried to get his associates to buy more land around the dome. He had also told them of 2 other prospects where land was available for the Gladys City Company. When they declined to expand their holdings, Higgins had gone out individually and bought options on the land for himself. In doing this, Higgins had far overextended his credit, and now he was afraid his directors were going to leave him with unpaid notes. Before they left their coffee, Carol and Brian decided that they would engage the services of M.B. Looney of Dallas, a sewage contractor who had been recommended by Higgins for boring the first hole on the hill. Looney had explained that he would subcontract the job to W.B. Sharp, a young but experienced well man. Later in the week, the directors met and approved the contract. The date was February 17th, 1893. Patillo Higgins and Walter Sharp saw eye to eye on most things. Sharp probably didn't believe that he was going to bring in a well that would produce thousands of barrels of oil daily, but he didn't debate the point with Higgins, the general manager of the Gladys City Company. He was interested in Higgins' story of his tribulations as they rode out to the hill. He was also interested in how Higgins had acquired the fine quarter horse and the gig they were riding in. Mr. Caswell, the druggist, had tried to sell them to him, but Higgins had proposed a trade for land in Gladys City. Caswell had declined, saying he needed the cash, $325. Higgins convinced George Carroll he needed the transportation, so a block of land had been given to Higgins, who had in turn borrowed the money from the bank, using the land as collateral. Someday, Higgins chuckled, "I will have a laugh on old Doc Caswell. That land will be worth tens of thousands of dollars. I think it is the best horse trade a man ever made." Sharp would live to see the day when Higgins would sell that block of land for $85,000. Out on the hill Higgins staked location for the hole. He drove his gig directly to a point near the Copperas Pond and told Sharp to start digging right there. It was less than a week later when Looney called Carroll and reported that Higgins had ordered him not to start the well. In fact, Higgins had told Looney to load his equipment and take it back to Dallas. Carroll was amazed. He called Brian, who hadn't heard of the order. A directors' meeting was called, and Higgins explained his arbitrary action. He had looked at the light rotary equipment, and he knew that it would not get down to the oil. There was no use wasting the Gladys city's time as well as that of Looney and Sharp. Looney had been told that good heavy equipment was necessary to go to 1,000 feet, and the contract had been signed for 1,500 feet, unless oil was encountered before that depth. Oil, Higgins said, would be found at around 1,000 feet, but that depth would never be bored with a machine only slightly bigger than a coffee grinder. Looney turned to Sharp, who said he felt that he could do the job. He had drilled wells deeper than that with the same equipment in other places. Higgins said he had never drilled a well in the kind of formation he would encounter here, and that he would never get down 500 feet. O'Brien explained to Higgins that if the contractors were not permitted to proceed, that the company would have to pay them $5,500 anyway. They had been given a contract to drill the first 1,000 feet for $3.50 a foot, and the next 500 for $4 a foot. Higgins still insisted that it might be better to compromise and pay them off, but he yielded to Carroll and O'Brien, who knew that Sharp was probably the best man in his field in the state. Patillo Higgins' pride suffered somewhat when the directors ordered that there would be no further interference with Sharp. It was stated in a resolution of the board that Higgins' authority as manager of the company did not include directing the operations of the contractor, and that in stopping the work when he did, he acted without authority. This was the first rift between Higgins and the members of the board. It was not considered serious, as Higgins admitted his error openly and privately resolved to do everything possible to assist Sharp in boring the hole. Sharp, however, hadn't gone more than 60 feet when he realized he was confronted with a serious problem. There he ran into a quicksand that gave him several days' delay. After that he ran into strange formations every 30 or 40 feet. He had 6 months to get down 1,500 feet or hit oil. Now he was averaging about 50 feet a month. When the 6 months had elapsed, he had made a little more than 300 feet. Higgins agreed to a 2-month extension of the contractor's time. He knew Sharp couldn't get down to the oil in that time, but he wanted him to have a chance. Furthermore, he was getting information from their cuttings. His only consolation had been that the hole was bearing out his theories as far as it went. In the next 2 months, Sharp was not able to improve his rate of progress, and decided not to seek another extension. Looney's bondsmen were sued by the Gladys City Company for non-performance of the contract, and most of the money invested by the company was recovered. The time lost had been disastrous to Higgins. The money he had invested in land had been lost. He was deeply in debt. His creditors even refused to accept the land he had in the Gladys City block, or the 33 acres he had purchased outside the block on the hill. They wanted cash, and so Higgins had to sell some of his older holdings, such as the land in Orange County, where the clay was located, to pay off part of his indebtedness. In spite of this disaster, Higgins still believed in the hill. He had a serious encounter with the local newspaper, which reported that the Sharp hole was dry. A reporter had obtained the information from one of Sharp's employees and had printed it. Higgins insisted that the newspaper explain that the hole was not dry, that it was incomplete. He pointed out that the contractor was obligated to go 1,500 feet and had only gone 418 feet. even with an extension of time. Again, he insisted oil would not be reached until a hole was bored at least 1,000 feet. There, he said, the greatest oil wells in the world would be found. Higgins was still manager of the Gladys City Company, but he was receiving no salary. The company had little money. He was being paid with his consent in land. His faith in the hill was as great as it ever was, and the land he owned would make him rich, he reasoned, when oil was found. Beaumonters were not surprised at the results of the first hole. They had begun to believe Higgins was over-enthusiastic, and that he should devote his time to something more productive, like the timber, cattle, or rice. His associates were discouraged, and Lanier had sold his stock to Carroll. Carroll, the only man who had actually put cash into the venture, retained his faith in Higgins, but he had been drained. O'Brien had not lost confidence completely, but he had grown lukewarm. He still believed Higgins was right about oil, but he felt that the Dream City was something they could forget. Out of a clear sky one day, the Gladys City Company received a proposal to lease its land for mineral development. The offer came from the Savage brothers, who described themselves as oil well borers from West Virginia. They were willing to pay a fair bonus and give a 10% royalty, but they wanted all of the Gladys City land. Petillo Higgins was against it. It meant that the Gladys City Company would wind up without control of the oil and gas production. This meant that his hopes for a great inland port and industrial city would vanish, or at least that others would be in the driver's seat. His argument was that this would eliminate everything he had planned for Beaumont, Gladys City, and Jefferson County. As seriously as the company needed the money, it must not succumb to this easy way out. Carroll and O'Brien knew that what he said was right, but they also knew their limitations. The panic of 1894 was in full swing. The lumber business had been dealt a severe blow. As lumber went, so went Beaumont. It was impossible even to consider paying another contractor to bore for oil. The first experience had resulted in most contractors shying off the hill. The price would be much greater than before, and no bondsman would be found to stand behind the contractors. The vote came, and Higgins was adamant to the last, but he lost. The lease was made with the Savage brothers. Higgins had absolutely no authority in this case, but he could still talk, and talk he did when he saw the equipment the Savage brothers were unloading on the hill that late spring morning in 1895. Higgins said it was not as good as that Sharp had. He was right. The Savage brothers were unloading cable tool equipment. Drillers were to learn in future years that the best cable tools made even 50 years later could not start to penetrate the mystery of the hill. With the Savage brothers was a geologist named Otley. He had a definite idea that oil would be found on the hill, but Higgins was not happy over the way he arrived at his conclusions. Otley had the oil vein theory, and said the vein came into Texas from out of the Rockies, and formed an oil lake when it reached the Gulf Coast. Otley was an interesting man to talk with, however, and he entertained Higgins for hours with his stories of oil. Pitch, Otley told him, was the mortar for the walls of Babylon. It was the sealer of the round boats of woven reed that plied the Euphrates before the dawn of Christian civilization. It had lubricated the axles of the chariots that bore the Egyptian kings, whose bodies had been embalmed in a crude petroleum fluid. The Chinese, he said, used natural gas 2,000 years ago for heat and light, conducting it into their homes through bamboo poles. Indians in America skimmed oil off water-filled sumps and used it for medicine and tonics and to waterproof their canoes. As late as 1858, a Dr. Keir made a rock oil natural remedy and then started distilling crude oil into kerosene to burn in lamps as a substitute for camphene, the dangerous mixture of alcohol and turpentine. He had sold 9 barrels for $275 in New York in 1858. Yes, Otley was interesting and entertaining, but Higgins doubted that he would be much help in conquering the hill. What the Savage brothers needed was the right equipment. Maybe after all, he reasoned, it is a blessing in disguise. Time would be lost, but more information about the formations would be gained, and oil would not be found. He was right. When the time limit was up, and the Savages had gone only 350 feet, Higgins was happy. He refused to grant an extension, and his arguments were so vigorous this time that the other directors went along with him. The forerunner of all great optimists in the oil business. Higgins now took to the streets again and started pleading with his fellow citizens to invest their money in another hole in the hill. He turned aside all arguments about the first 2 holes with the promise that he would make them millionaires. Untold millions of barrels of oil, he said, were there. The town's wiseacres started calling him the millionaire, and he laughed with them. He tried to get Carroll and O'Brien to use their influence in the community to help him peddle his bill of goods, but they were too busy trying to beat a panic. They knew, too, that it was impractical to try to raise money in such times. So persistent was Higgins that his fellow townsmen began to fear that he was losing his mind. He realized this, but the big hill had become an obsession with him, and he couldn't abandon it yet. Inside him he felt something tugging at his interest whenever his cause looked hopeless. Besides, he was the kind of man who fought the hardest when the odds against him were the strongest. Then came another disappointment. The directors leased all of their holdings again. The terms were the same as under the Savage lease. The lease was with the Texas Mineral Company, but the company was really the same Savage Brothers. They had incorporated under the Texas law and had gone to Sour Lake, 25 miles northwest, and drilled for oil. They had found a piddling well that produced 50 barrels of asphaltum-based crude from a very shallow depth, and they wanted another crack at the Gladys City area. Otley said this convinced him that he was on the trail of the elusive oil lake, and that the vein of oil had been penetrated at Sour Lake, pointing directly to Gladys City. Jim Savage and Otley had come to Beaumont and resold their idea to the Gladys City stockholders, in spite of Patillo Higgins' fight against a new lease. This fight was the last act on the part of Higgins in the company. He was disappointed and dejected. He told Carroll that his stock was for sale, and Carroll bought it. There was no bitterness or rancor, but Higgins left the company before the Savage brothers started the 3rd hole on the hill. Higgins felt that his associates were not heeding his advice, and that he should not burden them further with his objections and opposition. He offered his services in an advisory capacity in any way they saw fit to use them, but bowed out of the company. The third hole was just that, only it didn't get as far as the first two. The Savage brothers gained nothing but experience, but they did learn that cable tools would not do the job. Their experience was later valuable to them and to the world when they turned to rotary equipment to bring in the Cotto field in Louisiana, one of the most important discoveries after Spindletop. Patillo Higgins returned to the real estate business, but he retained his land and his interest in the hill. His idea now was to raise enough money to get the equipment he believed would penetrate the stubborn rock beneath the rise in the prairie. He would make enough money to live on and pay off some of his debts out of his business, and still have time to devote to organizing a syndicate to drill for oil. If the Gladys City Company would lease to others, it would lease to him. But first he must have confirmation that his oil theory was right. To have that, a recognized geologist must be called in. The state geologist would certainly agree with him, he reasoned, and investors might listen to a state official. One night he wrote a lengthy letter to E.T. Dumble, the state's chief geologist, explaining in detail what he had found on the hill. He asked that Dumble come to Beaumont and look over the mound prospect with him. The time was ripe, Higgins felt, to interest money in the hill. The panic was lifting early in 1898, and men would be more willing to invest. Somewhat belatedly, he received a letter from Dumble, who regretted that he could not make arrangements to come to Beaumont, but would send one of his assistants, a Mr. William Kennedy. When Kennedy arrived, Higgins kept him under wraps. He wanted this confirmation of his suspicions to come as a surprise to his fellow townsmen. He knew that if Kennedy agreed with him, as he undoubtedly would, he could raise enough money to get a good contractor with good equipment to bring in the well. After all the disappointments up to now could have been expected, it wasn't surprising that the Beaumonters were not taking his project seriously. 3 holes had been punched into the hill. As far as ordinary laymen knew, that was test enough. What they didn't understand, and wouldn't until Kennedy explained it, was that these had served as exploratory wells. They had really proved that only one thing was lacking, and that one thing was the right equipment. Higgins met Kennedy at the T&NO station, and the two men had lunch at the Crosby house while Higgins explained his geological ideas. He told Kennedy all that had happened in the first 3 wells. He explained about the quicksand and the engineering problems. "I know you will agree with my geological theories," Mr. Kennedy, Higgins said. "You will agree that as soon as we find an engineer who can get through quicksand, that we will find a great store of oil beneath it." Kennedy looked skeptical, but interested. He looked over the samples of rock recovered from the well, and he listened to the story about the pocket of gas Sharp and Savage had both found at about 60 feet. He heard about the quicksand and about the gas seepages. He didn't seem too enthusiastic, but Higgins felt that he was being professional, not wanting to appear too eager with these findings. The two went out to the hill. Higgins took Kennedy to the locations of the 3 unsuccessful holes. He explained in detail the troubles encountered in each. He had a log of each well, and those 3 logs proved his idea without a doubt, as far as they went. Higgins said oil would be found around 1,000 feet. Then Higgins gave Kennedy his analysis of the soil, made with crude chemical sets. Gradually it occurred to Higgins that Kennedy was not impressed. The man tried to look interested, but seemed to find this talk contrary to his own convictions. At last Higgins asked him what he thought. "What I think, Mr. Higgins, is that you are wasting your time and your money if you are looking for oil and gas here on the coastal prairie." This staggered Patillo Higgins. He looked at the geologist in amazement and disbelief. Here before him stood the one man he thought would understand his findings. Hadn't he shown him exactly what he was talking about? Hadn't he explained in even more detail than he had to his Gladys City Company associates? Here was an educated geologist, a man with a degree in the subject. What was wrong? "Rock, Mr. Higgins, is necessary before you find oil. A water well was drilled at the county courthouse in Beaumont a few years back. It went down 1,400 feet, and there was no sign of rock," Kennedy was saying. "Your theories are without scientific basis." Kennedy said that there was no precedent to confirm anything that Higgins had found or contended. He said that Higgins was working on an unproved premise, that if he, Kennedy, agreed, he would be doing a great injustice to those who might invest money in the project. Higgins stood on his hill a defeated man. His only thought was to get rid of Kennedy as fast as he could, and keep him quiet. The man was dead wrong, but his word would be heeded. Higgins realized that if Kennedy had agreed with him, the money would be easy to raise. He tried to understand the thinking of this man, who had been formally trained in geology. It was too much for him. He got Kennedy to the hotel and saw that he left town on the next train. For days, Higgins was stunned. He went back and checked all of his findings with his theories. He could find nothing wrong with them. It was Kennedy who was wrong, and it was fortunate that the people of Beaumont had not heard the opinion of this blinded man. Then 2 weeks after Kennedy had left Beaumont, it happened. The one thing Patillo Higgins was not prepared for. In the town's only newspaper was an article signed by Kennedy, telling of his findings in Beaumont. Based on a thorough investigation, he said, he was prepared to warn Beaumonters and others not to fritter away their dollars in the vain outlook for oil in the Beaumont area. Mr. Kennedy could have accomplished no more toward destroying the dream of Patillo Higgins had he come to Beaumont and moved the Gladys City Hill over to Russia. To this day, Higgins has never completely forgiven Kennedy for not telling him that he was going to write the article for the Beaumont paper. As the months went by, he understood, however, that if Kennedy felt this way, it was his duty to express himself. The one thing Higgins couldn't understand was the reason for Kennedy's tragic error. Higgins knew that oil-bearing rock would be found under the hill, but at a greater depth than had been drilled by the 3 early holes. Why Kennedy couldn't understand that the 3 holes were too shallow, and therefore inconclusive, Higgins could not for the world comprehend. It left him in a daze, and at this point Higgins' disrespect for men like Kennedy was born. As far as Beaumont capital was concerned, Kennedy had discouraged it completely. but thought Petillo Higgins that was only as far as Beaumonters are concerned. Beaumonters had not only ignored his pleas, some of them actually believed he was the victim of hallucinations, and were suggesting that he take a long rest. For 10 years he had wrestled with a single idea and had received the backing of Carroll and O'Brien, only to meet with one misfortune after another. Yet he was like a man inspired. He would not give up. He would go outside for help. George Carroll and Captain O'Brien heartily approved his idea to place an advertisement in a manufacturing journal. Of course they would lease the Gladys City property to him or to whomever he might interest in the proposition. They would do even better. They would give him or his associate an option to purchase part of the land and permit the drilling of a hole during the period of the option. He thanked his former associates and then prepared the advertisement. He stated that oil, gas, and sulfur were to be found at Big Hill, 4 miles south of Beaumont, and that he desired to make the arrangements for a lease, or an option to buy acreage in the area. He specified that the person answering the advertisement should be capable of adequately financing a proposition of some magnitude, but that the prospect for making millions of dollars was most promising. An answer was not long coming. It was the only reply he was ever to receive. That advertisement, probably the last hope Higgins had on earth for his hill, brought together two of the greatest pioneers in American history. The letter was signed, Captain Anthony F. Lucas. Chapter 3. The Captain. The Southern Pacific from the east was late that morning, as usual, but Petillo Higgins was on time. He sat in Dunlap's drug store across a narrow dirt street from the station waiting for Captain Anthony F. Lucas. He had time to think, and uppermost in his mind was the hope that Lucas would be capable of handling the obstreperous hill which had resisted the attempts of others to find its secret. Higgins knew that he must eventually abandon his own efforts, but he felt an obligation to himself and his community to see that the work was taken up by another. Higgins regretted that his hometowners had permitted this project to get into the hands of an outsider, but he was glad that an outsider was available. He tried to rationalize the stubbornness of Beaumonters. He knew there was no real money in town. Even the lumber mills, representing the city's only industry of any significance, paid their employees in company scrip, to be spent only in company commissaries. Cash was a scarce commodity, but if some of the city's people had only followed him in his belief in the hill, cash could have been plentiful. His efforts to convince them had been futile, however, and now this stranger would probably come and find the treasure Higgins had told Beaumont it should seek on its own. Outside of 33 acres on the south slope of the hill, and scattered lots in his undeveloped dream city, Higgins had little to gain. He had lost much in the years he had pursued the plan for an industrial oil city. He had spent $30,000. He had to stop because he owed $17,000. He had been forced to drop 550 acres on and near the hill that he had bought for $17 an acre. The time would come when this same land would bring more than $3 million to others. These thoughts were crowding his troubled mind as he heard the whistle of the train. In a few minutes he was extending his hand in welcome to the stranger, in whom he would place his hope for the Gladys City Hill. The captain was a handsome man, more than 6 feet tall. He was broad, erect, mature, and wore a full mustache. His countenance was a portrait of strength. His eyes were soft, yet they bore no trace of weakness. He received Higgins' welcome with a warm smile. His first words revealed a slight but interesting accent. Captain Anthony Francis Lucas was a naturalized American citizen. He was born on the island of Hvar in Dalmatia of Slavic parents named Lucic. He graduated from the School of Mining Engineering in Graz when he was 20 and then attended the Austrian Naval Academy in Fiume and Pola as a midshipman. At 24, he was commissioned a lieutenant in the Austrian Navy. Before going to sea, he decided to visit an uncle in Michigan for 6 months. His leave was extended, and he decided to apply for United States citizenship and change his name to Lucas, as his uncle had done. As an engineer, he made 3 times his Navy salary, and opportunity in America was far greater than it was for a Slav in the Austrian Navy. In 1887, Lucas married Carolyn Fitzgerald of Macon, Georgia, daughter of a prominent physician. Shortly thereafter, the captain and his bride moved to Washington. In 1893, a year after their son Anthony Fitzgerald was born, they moved to Louisiana, where Lucas was engaged as a mining engineer. He explored salt mines at Anse La Butte, Jefferson Island, Grand Cote, Petite Anse, and Weeks Island. One of his friends was Joseph Jefferson, the famous actor. The great masses of salt below the surface of the earth had attracted the captain's attention. He observed signs of oil, gas, and sulfur in most of them. He developed and worked on a theory that they were salt plugs around which it was possible for oil or sulfur to accumulate. On weekend excursions from Louisiana, Lucas visited some of Texas' coastal uplifts, including those at Beaumont and High Island. He found good indications of sulfur at Gladys City. Higgins' advertisement attracted him, and he decided to look at the prospect further, with a view toward investing his own capital if it looked good enough. Higgins and Lucas stood on the apex of the inverted saucer-like hill. Lucas explained his idea about salt domes, and Higgins told the captain why he believed the hill would be a prolific producer. He said it would not be surprising to him if the great well 500 miles north of Baku in Russia, which produced 100,000 barrels of oil in 11 hours in 1893 before dropping off, could be duplicated here. Higgins said that anticlinal pressure caused by this salt mass below the surface would produce geysers of oil. Lucas said he would be looking for sulfur, but that if oil were found, that would be good. Higgins made an appointment for Lucas with Carroll and O'Brien for the early afternoon. In the meantime, Lucas was interested in the kind of deal that could be made. You can lease the entire Gladys City Company holdings, or any part of them, Higgins said. I've been offered all of this 2,700 acres of land in fee for $20 an acre. My suggestion is, however, that you take a lease and option to purchase the 600 or 700 acres on and near to the hill. This can be handled for $50 an acre. On June 20th, several days after the captain's arrival in Beaumont, he signed a lease and option agreement for 663 acres. He agreed to pay $31,150. Of this he paid $11,050 cash and signed 7% promissory notes for like amounts to fall due on the next 2 anniversary dates of the agreement. That was the deal. He had all of the Gladys City's land on the hill, as well as protection on the north and west flanks. For his efforts, Batillo Higgins was given a 10% interest in the Lucas options. George Carroll agreed to match that amount from his part of any profits if the undertaking were successful. Lucas recorded his deal with Higgins, but Carroll's promise to Higgins amounted to a gentleman's agreement. While Higgins had originally asked 25% interest in the lease, he was satisfied with this compromise. Captain Lucas took Higgins' suggestion for a location for his well. It was east of the railroad tracks on Lot 44 in Gladys City, near where Higgins originally planned the company's drill site. Before the last of June, Lucas was ready to start drilling. Higgins had seen his equipment, a rotary rig Lucas had used in his Louisiana operations, and had ventured the opinion that it was too light. Lucas said it was the best he could get, and that he believed it might work, as he knew both the contractor and the equipment. It was early July when the hole was spudded. Lucas had planned carefully, but he was in for some surprises. Like Sharp and Savage before him, he was soon aware that Higgins knew his hill. The going was rough from the start. Weeks passed and progress was slow. The sweltering, torrid summer turned into a freezing winter, and still he was digging with little results. In Louisiana, he had been able to penetrate 2,100 feet in a couple of months, but this hill was different. Batillo Higgins watched the operation as closely as his time would permit. He told Carroll, who accompanied him to the hill one day in January, that he was afraid the captain had about reached his limit with the equipment and the help that he had. This was about the time that Lucas reached an oil sand and recovered 3 demijohns of heavy green crude. 2 days later, however, the driller came running to Lucas' home with the news that the pipe had collapsed because of gas pressure. Captain Lucas was stunned by the news. Following on the heels of the oil showing, this twist of fate was cruel. Thinking more of his family than of his theory, the captain told Carolyn Lucas this meant failure. His funds were not sufficient to start another well. "Anthony, you have some oil from the hill," Miss Lucas said. "I think it'll be easy to get financial help. I know your money is low, but this is such a big thing that you can share it with others." This assurance was needed, and it helped. Anthony Lucas became an oil wildcatter that moment. He would not look for sulfur, but for oil. Higgins had been right on that count, too. Now more than ever before, Captain Lucas realized the wisdom of Higgins' advice to get heavier equipment. That evening, Lucas and Higgins met in the French cafe, and the captain told of his failure. He also revealed that he was low financially and would need help if he were to try again. "Stopping is out of the question," Captain Higgins said. "You know what is below the hill now. I doubt it, but maybe local capital will help you. If not, you know that there are oil men who will. Yes, Higgins was right, Lucas thought. He would try Beaumonters first. They were entitled to a chance now that they could see the oil. His efforts were futile. Those he called on seemed to cringe at the thought that here was another Petillo Higgins to haunt them with wild talk about spouting oil wells. He decided to take his proposition to the Standard Oil Company. He was beginning to wear the Higgins mantle well. In a few days he was off to see Henry C. Folger, a Standard executive who had agreed to give him a hearing. En route to New York, Lucas stopped in Washington to visit friends and make a special call. He had been told that Congressman Sibley of Pennsylvania had been successful in oil operations and might be interested. The Honorable Mr. Sibley was in somewhat testy mood the day the captain arrived, but he admitted Lucas to his office. Far from being downcast, Lucas was enthusiastic. He took his jar of oil to the congressman and talked for 15 minutes before Sibley could get a word in. When he did, Lucas heard a lecture on oil prospecting, which ended with Sibley saying, "Captain Lucas, let me warn you against the dire consequences of unsubstantiated enthusiasm. The search for oil is risky, and not always as all-fired profitable as you might think. If you will assure me of several thousands of barrels of oil daily at Gladys City, I'll go along with you. Otherwise, I am not interested." The outburst amused the captain. He picked up his hat and thanked the gentleman from Pennsylvania for his time. "You know, Mr. Congressman, if I could assure you the production of several thousand barrels of oil daily, I doubt that I would be here asking for your assistance," Lucas said as he departed. The night before the captain saw Folger, New York was hit by a severe blizzard. The temperature dropped below zero. This afforded Lucas a chance to test the oil under such conditions, so he left one jar outside his hotel window that night. The next morning he was jubilant to find that the liquid had not congealed in spite of its low gravity of 17 degrees bomb. This proved the oil could be stored and transported easily in severe weather. In Folger's office, the captain made no attempt to conceal his enthusiasm. He told of the test, and Folger looked at the jar of oil with interest. "Mr. Folger," Lucas said, "I don't need money for myself. This is not a promotion whereby I'll take a salary and live on it, irrespective of the outcome. I want an association in further prospecting and proving this oil field and the theory of salt domes." Folger was gracious when Lucas had finished. He admitted he was doubtful, but said that before he turned down the prospect, he would have Calvin Payne, the company's expert in Titusville, make a trip to Beaumont. If Lucas could convince Payne, a deal might be made. In fact, Captain, Mr. Payne, and I recently advanced J.S. Cullinan money to start a refinery in Corsicana, Folger said. "Payne might like your deal. We could use more oil." In late February, Calvin Payne called on Lucas at his home. With him was J.S. Cullinan, the former Standard man who was now operating independently in Texas' largest oil field at Corsicana. The three men went out to the location where Lucas had drilled his first hole. He explained the operation and how it had ended. Then he told Payne and Cullinan of his experiences in Louisiana and how he had arrived at the nascent dome theory. He pointed to the circular elevation and how it varied in texture and structure from the surrounding sediments, which made up the prairie. Payne listened and then thought for some time before replying. He looked at Cullinan for an opinion, but Cullinan only smiled and remained silent. Captain Lucas, I have traveled around the world looking at oil fields in Russia, Romania, Borneo, and Sumatra, as well as most of the fields in the United States. Payne said, the indications you have pointed out, while noteworthy and most interesting, have no analogy to any field I have ever seen produce oil. I do not believe there is any chance for oil here in paying quantities. But Mr. Payne, Lucas said, holding up the demijohn of oil, here is the proof. Here is oil that came from this hill. It isn't all I am looking for, but it certainly proves that there is oil here. Payne shook his head and said that heavy black oil like that could be found almost anywhere, but that it couldn't be produced in quantities that would pay for boring the wells. Mr. Lucas, Payne said, I have learned enough about you to know that you are a fine mechanical and mining engineer. Why don't you go back to that profession and leave this risky and tricky business of oil to such people as Mr. Cullinan and me? You have completely misled yourself, and I know it has been expensive. You will never find oil here. For a fraction of a moment, Lucas almost capitulated. Payne was regarded as one of the world's renowned oil experts, a man who had started in the oil fields as a driller and had moved to one of the highest positions in the only large oil company in the world. I'm sorry you can't see the possibilities, Mr. Payne, Lucas said. I still believe they are here, and I will stay with the Hill if I can get the financial backing I need. I know you have gone to an expense to see this prospect, and I appreciate it. The weeks passed, and there was no sign of help. On several occasions, it is likely that Captain Lucas would have taken the advice of Calvin Payne, had not his wife encouraged him to go ahead. Lucas himself was prepared to face anything, but he was not willing to cause Miss Lucas and his boy Tony unusual hardship when he could get out of Beaumont and make a good living. In April, 2 distinguished visitors showed up in Beaumont. They were Dr. C. Willard Hayes of the United States Geological Survey and E. W. Parker, former chief statistician for that agency. Dr. Hayes stopped at the Crosby House and made himself available to discuss Gulf Coast geology. Captain Lucas was not long seeking him out. Lucas called Patillo Higgins and George Carroll and asked them to ride to the Hill with him and the 2 government men. Lucas directed the party around Gladys City. Higgins was amused. He had about as much confidence in a professional geologist, especially one who worked for the government, as he had in an East Texas weather prophet. He could see what Lucas was trying to do. The captain was covering the same ground Higgins went over when he talked with Kennedy. Lucas had one advantage. He could explain his salt dome theory, and maybe that would impress the geologist. Higgins had little hope, however, and was not surprised when Dr. Hayes disagreed with the Lucas theory and added that there was no precedent for oil being found in the unconsolidated sands and clays of the coastal plain. Captain Lucas, Dr. Hayes said, let me point out an event which apparently has escaped your notice. In Galveston County, not much more than 40 miles from this very spot, a hole was drilled to 3,070 feet recently, and not one drop of oil was recovered or even smelled. That cost the city of Galveston almost $1 million. It was a vast sum of money that I would hate to see you throw away here. Lucas knew about the Galveston well. He knew that the drillers were pursuing a different idea, seeking fresh water. They had no indication of a dome structure such as this hill. Hayes called attention to the absence of an oil seepage. Lucas referred to the Herman Frosch sulfur dome near Lake Charles, where a barrel and a half of oil was being produced daily along with the sulfur. He said salt domes required no seepage indications. There was no encouragement from Hayes. Higgins extended his sympathy to Lucas. He had been over the same ground, only Kennedy had used the water well at the courthouse instead of the one in Galveston County. Geologists had to have a precedent. They couldn't consider an original thought, he told Lucas. Captain Lucas, Higgins said, those men should be asking you, not telling you. Your experience in Louisiana makes you the greatest authority in the world, probably the only authority on salt domes. Yet these experts come and tell you this or that can't happen because it has never happened before. You believe there is oil here because there is a salt plug below, and I think you are right. I know there is oil here in greater quantities than man has ever found before. I wish I could help you, but I can't. But for God's sake, don't stop because ignorant men in high places say to stop, and get your backing before that man writes a letter to the Beaumont newspaper. There was one geologist who believed that Captain Lucas' theory had merit. Dr. William Battle Phillips, professor of field geology at the University of Texas, made a trip to Beaumont to see Lucas. He explained that he did not care to go against both the federal and state geological experts, but that he believed there was something to the nascent dome idea. Phillips suggested that Lucas go see Guffey and Galley in Pittsburgh. In fact, he gave him a written introduction to Galley. This, the first word of encouragement the captain had got outside his immediate family. Pattilla Higgins and the landowners gave him courage at a very critical time. It also gave him an idea. Guffey and Galley operated in Corsicana, and Galley might be there. In Corsicana, Galley was waiting for Lucas when he arrived. He told the captain that he had already heard of his dome theory, and also what Payne and Hayes thought of it. But, Captain, those gentlemen are not always right. Both my partner and I have recently brought in fine producers, where the experts said there would be no oil. Tell me about your idea. I like imagination and originality, Galley said. These were the kindest words he could have spoken. Lucas was given new hope with them. No detail of his theory was left untold, and Galley was fascinated. Your idea is revolutionary. Let me talk to Guffey, and I will write to you in a few days, Galley said. Better still, get on the train and come with me to Pittsburgh. I might need you to explain some of that. It is a little different from looking for oil scum on a creek bank or in a farmer's well. In Pittsburgh, Captain Anthony Lucas met the other half of the great wildcatting team of Guffey and Galley. James McClurg Guffey was a genius in his field, which was raising the money for Galley to find oil with. He was a pleasant man, with aesthetic features which belied his tremendous energy. Guffey was one of the stalwarts of the Democratic Party, and during the ill-starred Garfield regime had been chairman of the National Democratic Committee. His political sideline demanded much of his time and money. Guffey had great faith in John H. Galley, but the Hayes and Payne reports made him skeptical. "How much land do you control, Captain?" was his first question. When Lucas said 600 acres, Guffey replied that that was a mere pittance. The dome theory may be right, and all of the oil might be on the hill. But Guffey wanted to be sure. He demanded that Lucas get all of the hill, if possible, and as many acres as he could lease around it. The entire deal would depend on that. "Go back to Beaumont, Captain Lucas, and let me know how you come out between now and the 1st of July. Guffey said, "and mention this deal to no man. Guffey and Galley cannot be identified with it. If we are known, you will find land prices 10 times as high as they will be for a man who drilled a dry hole." Lucas asked if he could inform Higgins. "Who," asked Guffey, "is Higgins?" Lucas told him that Guffey replied that under no circumstances must anyone else know, not even Higgins. "And remember that Mr. Higgins is not to be part of this deal, unless it is to share in whatever profits you individually make out of it," Guffey said. "This will mean putting up 300,000 if we are to back you, and it is impractical to cut in everyone who ever heard of oil prospects in Texas." Lucas was not happy about keeping Higgins in the dark, but he knew that if Higgins understood that it was necessary to get the money, he would approve. In May, Lucas leased the 50-acre Chasen tract in the Hit survey and the 5,300 Hebert tract in the Sigler survey south of the hill. On June 20th, the anniversary of his first contract with the Gladys City Company, he succeeded in leasing the remainder of the hill, except for about 80 acres. Another 3,800 acres was leased southwest of the hill on the McClure-Collier-Cameron tract in the Hillbrant survey. With the 2,500 acres he could acquire from the Gladys City Company, that would give him around 15,000 acres by his deadline. His leases gave the landowners 1/10 royalty in oil or any other minerals he found. Lucas was quite pleased that he had acquired such large holdings before the deadline that Guffey laid down. However, the most remarkable omission of acreage from his block was the many small tracts which made up the Spindletop Heights subdivision, which ran across the hill and which was adjacent to the well location. There were other small parcels which varied from city lots to 15-acre tracts, which were also open. One of these holes in Lucas' block was Higgins' 33-acre tract, 100 feet from the well site. Guffey approved the land holdings, but said that in view of the fact that he and Galley were borrowing all of the money from the Mellon interest, they would have to have most of the prospect. Lucas got a relatively small part of the partnership of Guffey, Galley, and Lucas, but he had financed his hope of proving the dome theory. The terms had included the provision that Lucas was to draw no salary or other remuneration. This he had insisted on himself, in spite of his low finances, to prove his good faith. It had impressed Guffey. Galley said he would write to the Hamel brothers in Corsicana, the firm he wanted to drill the well. Guffey's parting shot was that while the contract called for 3 wells, that would hold only in the event that the first hole produced oil or looked promising. There was no obligation, he said, to drill 3 dry holes. Because of Payne and Hayes, the captain had no other choice. Honest though they both were in their opinions, it would have been far better had he seen Guffey and Galley before talking to the experts. It would have saved Payne and Hayes monumental embarrassment too. When Captain Lucas returned home, his family celebrated his arrival. The good news had preceded him by letter, and happiness filled the big frame house. Carrie, Lucas told his wife, things are going to be a little tight for us. Our funds are down to rock bottom, and I don't want to borrow. Miss Lucas looked around the house and pointed to several pieces of expensive furniture that had been brought from Washington. I have had dozens of people admire this old furniture, she said. We'll make it pay for our groceries until the well comes in. The captain appreciated her willingness to sacrifice. He knew the furniture would have to be sold and replaced by tables and chairs made from egg crates and apple boxes. He knew, too, that Tony would go to school in September. This meant spending more money for books and clothes. A devout Episcopalian, the captain had complete faith in his undertaking, and believed that the Lord would help him provide for his family in the meantime. The captain was in Corsicana to see the Hamel brothers, the day that John Galley came to Beaumont to stake the location for the well. Galley had only a short time to stay, so he accepted Miss Lucas' offer to go to the field while he marked the spot for the captain to drill on. He took the occasion to impress upon Miss Lucas, as the captain had already done, the necessity for secrecy. On the south side of the hill and the north edge of the McFadden Kyle and Weiss land, Galley found a hog wallow with 3 rough-hewn boxes full of sulphur water. Miss Lucas told him the farmers and ranchers brought their hogs there to kill fleas and cure the mange. It was a bald, alkali spot surrounded by a sea of undulating marsh grass, whipped by the coastal winds and deep in the smell of salt spray. As near as he could place the stake to the southmost box, he drove it a foot into the ground. Turning then to Miss Lucas, John Galley smiled and said, "Tell that captain of yours to start that first well right here, and tell him that I know he is going to hit the biggest oil well this side of Baku. Anyway, bless you both, and let me hear from you if you need anything." John Galley drove off, telling Miss Lucas to say nothing to anyone about his being there. She promised, and to herself she chuckled over Galley's remark about needing anything. She knew Anthony Lucas well enough to know that no one outside his little family would know it if they were all starving. John Galley was lucky with his stake driving that day. Had he decided to go 50 feet south of the hog wallow, he would have found himself and the Honorable James McClurg Guffey financing a dry hole. A great deal of the history of the world was tied to that decision, and as in the case of all wild-catters, it is not known whether he was lucky or just plain smart. When John Galley hired the Hamel brothers to drill the well at Gladdy City, he didn't do it altogether because he enjoyed the conviviality of Jim Hamel. That helped, but Galley was a smart operator. He knew from his studies of the first 4 holes in the hill that the job was going to be one that would require resourcefulness, and John Galley knew that in the Hamel brothers he had that word personified. It took Captain Anthony Lucas only a few hours to realize that after he met Al Hamel, the youngest brother in Beaumont, Al formed the one-man advance detachment for the drilling crew that would dig the Lucas well. Lucas met him at the train, and Al explained that the first thing he wanted to do was line up the lumber for the derrick and wood for boiler fuel. The 2 men went to see George Carroll at his lumber yard. After the derrick lumber had been arranged for, Carroll made an offer. "Mr. Hamel," he said, "if you bring in a well that will flow at least 5,000 barrels of oil a day, the lumber for your derrick will be my present." Al Hamel hardly took this as a generous offer. He was accustomed to big 50-barrel wells in Corsicana. To him it was like offering a new hat to a mediocre hitter for slugging 3 home runs over a 600-foot center field fence in one game. Lucas explained to Al when they left the lumber yard that Patillo Higgins had predicted wells on the hill that would produce thousands of barrels a day, and that Carroll had implicit faith in Higgins. "It might surprise you to know that I believe you will drill that well with a free derrick too," Lucas told Hamel, but that wasn't the incident that caused the captain to banish the last vestige of doubt he might have had about his drilling contractors. Lucas had complained to Al that he could not get a car of pipe unloaded. A local contractor looked at the pipe-laden gondola and had declined the job, suggesting a house mover. The house mover had called the project an enormous one, requiring a rig and horsepower, but even before that, it would be necessary to make an estimate of cost and time. Now, Mr. Hamel, the railroad company is crying for its gondola, and it looks like it will be several days before I can return it to them," Lucas said. Al asked where the pipe was located, and was told it was on a spur line near the hill. He suggested that they go look over the problem. When he got there, Al Hamel climbed up on the pipe, took off his coat, threw 2 pieces of 6-inch pipe over the side to serve as slides, and told Lucas to stack the pipe as he threw it down. In a little more than an hour, Al Hamel had unloaded 500 feet of 10-inch, 900 feet of 6-inch, and 1,200 feet of 4-inch pipe. Captain Lucas was an Al Hamel man from that day on. The incident illustrates also how unprepared Beaumont was for the Industrial Revolution it was soon to face. The incredulous house mover had to be shown the results of the feat on the ground. He wouldn't believe Lucas when the captain told him why his services would not be required. The Hamels had what they considered a very good contract. They would get $2 a foot, and Guffey and Galley would furnish the pipe. With their new rotary rig, which Kurt Hamill had been working with, they could drill ordinary wells for 35 cents a foot. The cable tool method had cost them about 75 cents a foot. They had spent $400 on their new rig for a rotary, drawworks, pump, and swivel. A week after Al arrived, the remainder of the crew came in. Kurt, the derrick man, was the other brother who would work on the Lucas job. Jim Hamill remained in Corsicana to run the company. Henry McLeod was the driller, and Peck Beard was the fireman and the fourth member of the crew. Completely without experience, the Hamills had to build a derrick. In Corsicana, derrick builders did the job, but there were none in Beaumont. They simply made a pattern and laid the derrick out on the ground. When they were finished, it was perfect. Oil stories were not frequent in Beaumont, but on October 26th, the Journal had one. It quoted Captain Lucas, who denied rumors that oil had been found on the hill. The captain explained that the drillers had not even started the hole yet. The next day, however, the hole was spudded. The Hamills solved the quicksand problem early. Kurt had found that when the drilling fluid was heavy, the sidewalls of the hole seemed to hold better. He hit upon the idea of driving a herd of McFadden's cattle into the slush pit to muddy up the water. The 60-foot quicksand problem was that easy, and with that act, an idea was born for drilling mud. Without it, today, there would be a few oil wells drilled. Trouble came when the Hamills reached 160 feet. There, even the heavy mud would not close off the side walls. The formation seemed to be coarse, sand and gravel up to the size of eggs. Lucas was told about the problem, and he admitted that he had no solution. The hole was being drilled with 8-inch pipe, and it was impossible to proceed as long as the loss of circulation prevented the cuttings from returning to the top of the hole. This same difficulty had stopped both Sharp and Savage. The Hamills finally decided they would try to drive the 8-inch pipe down and wash with 4-inch inside the larger pipe, which would serve as casing until the coarse formation was penetrated. This proved to be one of the monumental accomplishments of all time in well drilling. A drive head was rigged up on the bottom of the 8-inch pipe. It was a sharply beveled bit that would simply bite into the earth. A heavy drive block was forged to use on top of the 4-inch pipe, in the manner of a pile driver. Driving power was achieved by pulling the cathead line and giving it a quick slip to get the hardest blow possible. This was done by hand, and the crew members took turns at the man-killing job. As often as possible, the circulating pump would be started to wash the sand from the bottom of the 8-inch pipe. Some days the crew would make only a few feet, and on other days progress would be better. It took more than 2 weeks to go through 285 feet of sand and gravel. Captain Lucas watched, prayed, and marveled. Henry McLeod decided there was an easier way of making a living, and retired during the operation. The next crisis came after the gumbo was reached at 445 feet, and normal rotary drilling was resumed. The drillers had gone about 200 feet more when they hit a gas pocket. The circulating mud began to boil and flow up through the rotary table. Shortly, muddy water and gas were spouting halfway up the derrick. The small blowout was finally controlled, but then it was obvious that to prevent future disaster, it would be necessary to keep the circulating pumps going 24 hours a day. Until this time, the three-man crew had worked only in the daylight hours. Every third day now, one of the crew had to work an 18-hour shift. The nightman did not try to drill. He merely kept up steam to keep the pumps in motion and the drill pipe rotating slowly. Captain Lucas visited the well one cold day in early December, and Kurt Hamill told him the pipe was stuck due to gas pressure. There was 100 feet of sand in the pipe, and it seemed impossible to go ahead. This was happening every time the counter pressure exerted by the pump was stopped to put on another joint of pipe. Various suggestions were offered, like going over the 6-inch pipe with larger pipe, but the larger pipe would also stick. No greater problem had been encountered. Lucas was distressed, and the drilling crew was afraid it had reached the end of its resourcefulness. Carolyn Lucas heard her husband say that it seemed the second failure was inevitable. She offered encouragement, but it didn't seem to relieve his mind. There was no sleep for Anthony Lucas that night. He turned and tossed and wrestled with his problem. As he lay there, he began to wonder how a boiler having a 100-pound pressure could be pumped full without any water escaping. Suddenly, the answer came. It was because a boiler was equipped with a check valve. He jumped from his bed and threw his clothes on as he dashed out of the house. His wife and son feared that the mental burden had been too much for him. He rushed to the woodshed and picked up a pine box and a discarded rubber belt. He hurriedly hitched his buggy and drove to the hill where Al Hamill was doing his 18-hour shift. Excitedly, he told Hamill of his idea. Soon, Kurt and Peck were on the job, and a check valve had been rigged up out of a pine board, with perforations in the center and a small rubber belt underneath. It was placed between the couplings of the casings, and the trouble was overcome. Spindletop Heights was a real estate development which extended like a long pointing finger into the center of the hill proper. In August, Captain Lucas had leased 122 acres of this land from Guy W. Junker. In November, he had leased another 15 acres from J.M. Page. Off to the west of his periphery of the hill, he had leased 834 acres in the Rowe and Stivers surveys. As late as December 1st, he had closed a deal with J.F. Keith, one of the city's leading lumbermen, for 4,800 acres in the Areola League, several miles north of Beaumont in Hardin County. Wherever and whenever he could, he was leasing land to protect his partnership in the event oil was found. One December morning, while talking to Kurt Hamill, the captain took a sudden interest in a lump of clay found on a fish-tail bit. Examining the clay closely, he saw a piece of rock the size of a small egg. That explains why the drilling has been so hard lately, Kurt, Lucas exclaimed. Kurt looked puzzled, and the captain explained further. You have drilled into the dome structure proper. This proves we are right. Then he showed young Hamill limestone with calcite intercalations. He also pointed out fragments of dolomite and sulfur. This is the best thing that has happened, boys, Lucas exclaimed to the crew. Watch now for something good any day, and say a little prayer." The captain rushed home with his great find, to show Caroline and Tony. They were as puzzled over the evidence for his happy excitement as the Hamels had been, but they were delighted to see him enthusiastic again. That night it was Al Hamel's turn for the 18-hour shift. About 3 o'clock in the morning he noticed the pump working more freely than it had for days, and the rotary was turning easily. Al began to let pipe down the hole. Still the pump and rotary responded freely. He had let almost an entire length of pipe down when he detected a gassy odor. He tried to investigate, but the light on the rig was not bright enough. Soon day began to dawn, and he could then see an oil scum on the ditch and in the slush pit. Kurt and Peck Beard showed up about that time, and Peck was sent running for the captain. Lucas was excited when he arrived. Peck had told him about the oil. "What will she make?" Lucas asked Al. The Hamels thought a 50-barrel well was a whopper. It was the biggest Corsicana had in an area where the average well was good for 10 barrels a day. "I'd say 50 barrels, Al replied, with his tongue in his cheek. Lucas then ordered another joint of pipe to test the depth of the formation. Soon another 35 feet had been drilled, and the drilling became harder. The pipe was resting on hard rock at 880 feet. The captain said he would wire Galley to come at once. In the meantime, he ordered the crew to set 4-inch drill pipe as a test string. Galley arrived a few days later, and the men started bailing the whale. There was a small flow of oil. Then the bailer was run again, and it was found that 300 feet of soft sand had heaved up into the hole. For the next week, efforts to bring the well in were fruitless. The 4-inch pipe was pulled, and 6-inch was landed on the top of the hard formation at 880 feet. While this was going on, the Beaumont Journal came out with a story about the well. It told of oil being discovered and then lost, but suggested that Captain Lucas had met with some success. Without using Galley's name, the newspaper told about the expert from Pennsylvania, who had seen the well and declared it lost because of salt water in the heaving sand. Some doubt as to the future of the well, and indeed the entire prospect was expressed. The story posed a question about what Captain Lucas would do next. It stated that his present concern was saving pipe that was in the hole and worth some 4,000. Winding up on a sad note, the story said, but all is speculation, mingled with disappointment to Captain Lucas, which is too keen to be appreciated, and too delicate to find expression in words. The story didn't bother Lucas and Galley. It gave them a great advantage. They knew now that they could make an oil field on the hill. Whether this well could be completed or another well would have to be drilled nearby was the only question. What no one knew was how big the well would be. Even Al Hamel was dubious about his 50-barrel guess, and the grade of oil seemed far below that of Corsicana. But everyone knew enough to know that more acreage had to be obtained to keep the situation from getting out of hand when the well did come in. Galley said if this well would not produce, a second would be started at once. On the day before Christmas, John Galley called Kurt, Al and Peck Baird together and told them to put the well in shape and go home for the holidays. He advised Captain Lucas to do what he could about closing up the gaps. in the land situation. He gave the captain an almost impossible job. Landowners and courthouse clerks were occupied with Christmas activities. On New Year's Day, 1901, the first day of the 20th century, the two Hamill brothers and Peck Beard were back on the job. They didn't know how far they had to go, but they knew they needed help. Efforts to recruit labor were not successful. Big, healthy boys and men would come to the well and watch the strange proceedings, but when they were asked if they wanted a job, they always had an excuse. They were leery of the work on the hissing, clanking, rattling contraption the Hamill brothers called a rig. It was January 2nd, and rumors were rife again. The skies in the area of the hill were brilliantly illuminated, and Beaumonters believed that this was due to gas burning at the well. The captain admitted the gas. "Bless you, yes, we have gas," Lucas was quoted in the journal as saying, "enough to stock a book agent." But the illumination was apparently the light of St. Elmo's fire. On January 9th, the Hamills were still perplexed by the mysteries of this strange hill. They had gone through 140 feet of solid rock to a total depth of 1,020 feet. There, the bit seemed to hit a crevice, and again problems that seemed insurmountable arose. When Kurt tried to rotate the pipe, it would jerk the rotary chain to pieces, but he kept grinding away with no apparent headway. Galley had ordered that the well be taken to the contract depth of 1,200 feet, and if nothing were found deeper, to back up and perforate the pipe in the 845-foot sand and try to complete the well. Failing in that, he said, a second hole would be drilled. Beaumont had no supply house, so Al wired Jim Hamill for another fishtail bit and some new rotary chains to be picked up the next morning. Captain Lucas was worried. He knew he had an oil sand, but the pressures and sands and gumbo were obstacles never encountered in oil well drilling before. He was not sure the hill would ever produce, in spite of John Galley's cheerful optimism. The words of Calvin Payne kept haunting him. The black oil from the first hole could be found anywhere, but it had no value. After supper, Anthony and Carrie Lucas were sitting in the living room of their home. Suddenly the hill seemed to light up with a fantastic glow, and then the great light seemed to gather into one large ball of flame and come to rest on the crown block of the derrick. The Hamills said it gave off a low hissing sound for a few minutes. It was the St. Elmo fire, which for centuries had visited the hill as if beckoning men to a great treasure. It was the last time this phenomenon would ever be seen on the hill. The captain told Carrie what it was. "Doesn't that have a special meaning for men of the sea?" she asked. "Yes," Anthony Lucas replied, still gazing at the hill. "It means their ship will come safely into harbor."